Story 1. The Man Who Didn't Get Off. Our first story comes from a young woman named Chloe, who, in the autumn of 2013, was a college student traveling on a shoestring budget. To save money on a trip home for Thanksgiving, she booked a ticket on a Greyhound bus, a grueling 14-hour overnight journey that would take her from her university in Oregon down to her family's home in Northern California. She'd taken the bus before and knew the drill. Find a window seat, put on headphones, and try to sleep through the long, dark hours. She had no idea that this particular trip would trap her in a slow-burn nightmare orchestrated by the silent passenger in the seat behind her. Chloe boarded the bus in Portland just as the evening rush hour was ending. The bus was old, with worn, slightly grimy seats and the faint, lingering smell of disinfectant and exhaust fumes. She found an empty two-seater about halfway down the aisle, claimed the window seat, and settled in. The bus was only about half full, a collection of weary-looking travelers, students like herself, and people who seemed to have nowhere else to be. As the bus pulled out of the station and onto the highway, the last empty seat in her row, the aisle seat, remained vacant. She breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the extra space. The city lights soon gave way to the dark, rain-slicked expanse of Interstate 5. Chloe put on her headphones, leaned her head against the vibrating window, and watched the raindrops trace jagged paths across the glass. The first stop was a small, dimly lit station in Salem, about an hour into the journey. A few people got off, and a few more got on. One of them was a man who began walking down the aisle, his eyes scanning the remaining seats. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, with a gaunt, sallow face and thinning, greasy hair. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that looked like it had been slept in. His eyes, dark and deeply set, seemed to linger on Chloe for a moment before he continued down the aisle. She felt a small, inexplicable prickle of unease, but she quickly dismissed it. The man walked all the way to the back of the bus, then turned and walked back towards the front. He did this twice, his slow, deliberate pace making it seem less like he was looking for a seat and more like he was inspecting the passengers. Finally, he stopped at Chloe's row. Despite there being several completely empty two-seaters available, he paused, looked directly at her, and then, without a word, slid into the aisle seat next to her. Chloe's body tensed. The man's proximity felt like an invasion. He was close enough that she could smell the stale cigarette smoke on his clothes and the faint, sickly sweet scent of cheap cologne. He didn't put a bag down. He didn't take off his jacket. He just sat there, perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at the seat in front of him. Trying to be polite, Chloe gave him a small, tight-lipped smile and a nod. He didn't respond. He didn't even seem to register her presence. It was as if he had chosen the seat next to her but was now determined to pretend she didn't exist. The awkward, heavy silence was worse than if he had tried to make small talk. Chloe turned back to the window, cranking up the volume on her headphones, trying to create a wall of sound between herself and the strange man beside her. But she was acutely aware of him. She could feel his stillness, his silent, unnerving presence. An hour later, the bus pulled into another small station. A few more people boarded. The man next to Chloe didn't move. He just continued to sit there, staring forward, a silent, rigid statue. Chloe started to feel a creeping sense of dread. His behavior was just too strange. It wasn't overtly threatening, but it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. As the bus continued its journey south through the dark, rainy Oregon night, the man's strange behavior escalated in a subtle, terrifying way. Chloe, pretending to be asleep, would watch him from the corner of her eye. He would remain motionless for long stretches, and then he would perform a small, strange, repetitive action. He would slowly, deliberately, reach into his suit pocket and pull out a small, ornate silver locket. He would open it, stare at the contents for a full minute without blinking, and then snap it shut with a soft, metallic click. He would then put it back in his pocket. 5 minutes later, he would repeat the exact same ritual. Open, stare, click, close. Over and over again, it was the compulsive, obsessive action of a deeply disturbed mind. Chloe felt trapped. She was pinned against the window, with this strange, ritualistic man blocking her only exit into the aisle. She thought about getting up and moving to another seat, but she was afraid of what he might do if she disturbed him. She felt safer pretending to be asleep, hoping he would just continue to ignore her. Around 2 a.m., the bus made a scheduled 30-minute stop at a larger travel center for a driver change and a chance for passengers to stretch their legs and get food. This was her chance. As the bus hissed to a stop and the driver announced the break, Chloe's heart pounded. She waited for the man to get up, but he didn't move. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I need to get out." The man slowly, deliberately, turned his head to look at her. It was the first time he had acknowledged her since sitting down. His eyes were flat, gray, and completely devoid of any light or emotion. They were like the eyes of a fish. He stared at her for a long, terrifying moment, his face a blank mask. Then, without a word, he stood up and stepped into the aisle, allowing her to pass. Chloe practically ran off the bus, her lungs gasping for the cold, fresh air. She hurried into the brightly lit travel center, her whole body trembling. She bought a coffee she didn't want, just to have an excuse to stay inside, away from him. She watched the man through the window. He never got off the bus. He just returned to his seat and resumed his silent, forward-facing vigil. She knew she couldn't get back on that bus and sit next to him. The thought filled her with a visceral, absolute dread. She saw the bus driver, a new one, a friendly-looking woman, and on a desperate impulse, she approached her. "I'm sorry to bother you," Chloe began, her voice low and urgent. "But the man sitting next to me, something's wrong with him. He's acting really strange. Is there any way I can move to a different seat?" The driver gave her a sympathetic but weary look. "Honey, you can sit wherever you want as long as it's empty, but I can't make him move, and I can't kick him off the bus unless he's actively threatening someone." Chloe tried to explain his behavior, the staring, the weird ritual with the locket, but she could hear how flimsy and paranoid it sounded. The driver just shrugged. "Look, just find another seat. It'll be fine." Defeated, Chloe waited until the last possible moment to reboard the bus. She scanned the seats. There was an empty two-seater near the very front, right behind the driver. It was the most visible, most public seat on the bus. She decided that was her best option. She took her bag and hurried to the front, avoiding even looking in the direction of her old seat. She settled into the new window seat, her back to the rest of the bus, and prayed the man would just leave her alone. For the next hour, everything was quiet. Chloe started to relax. Maybe moving seats had been enough. Maybe he hadn't even noticed she was gone. She finally allowed her exhaustion to take over, and she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, her head against the window. She was awakened by a smell, the sickly, sweet, cloying scent of cheap cologne. Her eyes snapped open. He was there. He was standing in the aisle right next to her seat, leaning over her. His gaunt, sallow face was just inches from hers. His dead gray eyes were fixed on her, and he was holding the small silver locket, dangling it from its chain in front of her face. "It's for you," he whispered, his voice a dry, dead rasp. "She would have wanted you to have it." Chloe screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror that ripped through the quiet bus. She scrambled away from him, pressing herself against the window, trying to make herself smaller. Her scream jolted the entire bus awake. The driver, a tough-looking woman, slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching to a halt on the shoulder of the dark highway. "What the hell is going on back there?" she yelled. The man didn't even flinch. He continued to stand over Chloe, dangling the locket, his face completely devoid of expression. "Take it," he whispered. "It's a gift." The driver was out of her seat in an instant, a heavy metal flashlight in her hand. "Get away from her, now!" she commanded, her voice booming with authority. The man slowly straightened up and turned to face the driver. He looked at her, then at the other passengers who were now standing, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. He seemed to see them all for the first time. A look of profound, bewildered panic crossed his face, as if he had just woken up from a long dream and had no idea where he was or what he was doing. He looked back at Chloe, his eyes suddenly filled with a desperate, pleading terror that was almost as frightening as his previous emptiness. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then he turned and bolted. He ran to the front of the bus, shoved the main door open with a pneumatic hiss, and leaped out into the darkness. He scrambled down the embankment on the side of the highway and disappeared into the thick black woods. The bus was in chaos. The driver immediately called the police. They arrived within minutes, their flashing lights bathing the scene in a strobing, surreal glow. Chloe, sobbing and shaking, told them everything: the man, the locket, the whispering. The police searched the woods for hours, but they found no trace of the man. He had vanished, but he had left something behind. Lying on the floor of the bus, where he had been standing, was the small silver locket. A police officer, wearing gloves, picked it up and opened it. He showed it to Chloe. On one side was a faded photograph of a smiling, elderly woman. On the other side was a picture of a young girl, no older than 16, with Chloe's face. It was not a picture of Chloe. It was an old, faded photograph from the 1970s or 80s. The girl in the picture had a different hairstyle, different clothes, but her face, her eyes, her smile, her bone structure, was impossibly identical to Chloe's. The story was pieced together later. The man was a recently released patient from a psychiatric hospital in Oregon. The elderly woman in the locket was his mother. The young girl was his sister, who had died in a car accident 30 years earlier, when she was 16. A sister who, by a 1 in a billion coincidence of genetics, looked exactly like Chloe. He had been off his medication and, in his delusional state, had fixated on Chloe, believing she was the reincarnation of his long-dead sister, someone he had to protect on her journey. Chloe was given a ticket for the next bus, but she couldn't take it. Her parents drove the 6 hours to come and get her. She never took an overnight bus again. The experience had shattered her sense of anonymity and safety. She was forever haunted by the memory of that gaunt face leaning over her in the darkness, the dead gray eyes, and the whispered words, "It's for you." She had been the unwilling object of a madman's grief, a living ghost in his fractured reality, a terrifying reminder that on a long, dark bus ride, you never know whose demons might be sitting right behind you. Story 2. The Last Stop. The Greyhound route that runs along Interstate 10, connecting the sprawling metropolises of the Sun Belt, is a journey through a landscape of stark contrasts. It moves from the humid, swampy bayous of Louisiana to the vast, arid emptiness of West Texas. Our second story comes from this route, from a man named Ben, a construction worker who, in the winter of 2009, was traveling from Houston to El Paso to start a new job. He was a practical, no-nonsense man, used to rough conditions and long hours. But on this particular overnight trip, he found himself on a bus that seemed to be on a schedule not set by the company, a terrifying journey to a final, unscheduled stop. Ben boarded the bus at the Houston terminal late on a Friday night. The air was cold and damp. The bus was crowded, filled with a cross-section of humanity. Families visiting relatives, soldiers on leave, and solitary travelers like himself. He found a seat near the back, next to a quiet, elderly woman who immediately fell asleep. Ben was not a man prone to anxiety. To him, the bus was just a tool, a means to an end. He put his head back, closed his eyes, and let the drone of the engine lull him into a light doze. He was awakened a few hours later by the bus pulling into a brightly lit station. It was San Antonio. The stop was a chaotic flurry of activity. The elderly woman next to him got off, and a new wave of passengers boarded, filling nearly every remaining seat. Ben watched them with detached interest. One man, in particular, caught his attention. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed head to toe in black. Black cowboy boots, black jeans, a black pearl snap shirt, and a black Stetson hat pulled down low, shadowing his face. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his eyes scanning the bus not like a man looking for a seat, but like a wolf surveying a herd. He walked down the aisle, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud on the rubber flooring. He passed Ben's row, continued to the very back, and then, finding no empty seats, he turned around. As he walked back towards the front, his gaze fell on the now empty aisle seat next to Ben. He stopped. Ben gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent signal that he preferred the space. The man in black ignored it. He didn't ask or make a gesture. He simply turned and slid into the seat, his large frame crowding Ben against the window. The man's presence was immediately oppressive. He was big, solid, and radiated a strange, cold stillness. He smelled faintly of whiskey and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that Ben couldn't quite place. The man didn't speak. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat, staring straight ahead. Ben tried to ignore him, turning his attention back to the dark landscape outside. But he was intensely aware of the man's proximity. The bus pulled out of San Antonio and back onto the dark, empty expanse of I-10. The interior lights were dimmed, and most of the passengers settled back into a state of quiet repose. An hour passed in silence. Ben was starting to drift off again when the man next to him finally moved. He didn't turn or speak. He simply lifted his right hand from his knee and placed it on the empty space on the seat between them, just inches from Ben's leg. Ben's eyes flickered down. The man's hand was large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. But what made Ben's breath catch in his throat was the tattoo. On the back of the man's hand, inked in crude dark lines, was a single stylized letter, a capital Z. Ben had seen that symbol before. He was from Texas, and he knew the stories. It was the mark of the Zetas, one of the most ruthless and violent drug cartels in Mexico. It was a symbol of pure, unadulterated brutality. This man wasn't just a cowboy. He was, in all likelihood, a sicario, a cartel enforcer. A wave of cold, paralyzing fear washed over Ben. He was trapped on a moving bus, inches away from a man who was almost certainly a professional killer. He kept his eyes fixed on the window, his body rigid, trying to appear calm and asleep. His mind raced. What was a cartel member doing on a Greyhound bus? Was he running from something, or was he on his way to do a job? The bus continued to hurtle through the West Texas night. The landscape outside was a vast, featureless void. The towns were small, isolated pockets of light separated by immense stretches of absolute darkness. At each stop, Kerrville, Junction, Sonora, a few people would get on or off, but the man in black never moved. He just sat there, a silent, menacing statue, his tattooed hand resting between them like a coiled snake. Around 3 a.m., somewhere in the desolate stretch between Sonora and Fort Stockton, the bus began to slow down. This was unusual. There were no scheduled stops for another hour. Ben, peering out the window, saw that they were pulling off the interstate and onto a dark, unmarked service road. A murmur of confusion went through the bus. A few people sat up, looking around. The bus driver's voice came over the intercom, but it was strained, tense. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just making a brief unscheduled stop. Please remain in your seats. The bus bumped along the dirt road for a few hundred yards and then pulled to a stop. The driver killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the nervous coughs of the passengers. Outside, there was nothing. No lights, no buildings, just the vast, impenetrable darkness of the Texas desert. The man in black next to Ben finally moved. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time Ben saw his face in the dim emergency lighting. His features were sharp, cruel, with a thin, jagged scar running down his left cheek. His eyes, cold and black, met Ben's. The man gave a slow, deliberate wink. Then he stood up. He wasn't the only one. Two other men, who had been sitting separately in different parts of the bus, also stood up. They were dressed in plain clothes, but they moved with the same quiet, predatory confidence as the man in black. They had been on the bus since Houston. They were part of his crew. The man in black walked to the front of the bus. He said something to the driver in a low, quiet voice that Ben couldn't hear. The driver, his face pale and beaded with sweat, nodded numbly. The man then turned to face the passengers. "Buenas noches," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble with a thick accent. "My apologies for the delay. We just need to pick up a package. This will only take a moment. Please stay calm. Stay in your seats. No one will be harmed." His tone was calm, almost polite, but it carried an absolute, unquestionable threat. The passengers were frozen in a state of collective terror. No one spoke. No one moved. The bus had been hijacked. The man in black nodded to one of his accomplices, who opened the main door of the bus. A moment later, a pair of headlights appeared on the dirt road approaching the bus. It was a dusty, beat-up pickup truck. It pulled up alongside the bus, and two more men got out. They went to the side of the bus and opened the luggage compartment with a key the bus driver had apparently given them. Ben, craning his neck to see out the window, watched in horror as they pulled out several large, heavy duffel bags. They weren't passenger luggage. They had been preloaded. The bus wasn't just a bus. It was a mule, a transport vehicle for a cartel shipment. But then they pulled out something else. It wasn't a bag. It was a person, a man, his mouth gagged with duct tape, his hands and feet bound. He was alive, his eyes wide with frantic, primal terror. He was the package. The men from the pickup truck threw the bound man into the back of their vehicle like a sack of grain. They loaded the duffel bags, slammed the doors, and then gave a sharp nod to the man in black, who was still standing at the front of the bus. The pickup truck turned around and sped off into the darkness, its taillights disappearing into the void. The hijacking was over. The transfer was complete. The man in black turned back to the passengers. He slowly scanned the faces, his cold, dark eyes lingering on each person as if memorizing them. His gaze fell on Ben, and he held it for a long, terrifying moment. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile, a look that said, "You saw nothing." He then turned, walked calmly off the bus, and got into another vehicle, a dark SUV that had pulled up behind the bus, its lights off. His two accomplices followed him. They got in, and the SUV drove away, also disappearing into the desert night. For a full minute, the bus was completely silent. The passengers and the driver were in a state of collective shock. Then, people started to talk, to cry, to ask what had just happened. The driver, his hands shaking, got on his radio and called his dispatcher, his voice cracking as he reported the hijacking. The police and border patrol arrived about 30 minutes later. The scene was chaotic. They took statements from everyone. Ben told them about the man in black, the Z tattoo, the bound man. The authorities already knew who he was. He was a high-ranking sicario known as El Martillo, the Hammer. The bus had been used, without the company's knowledge, to transport a rival cartel member who was being taken across the border to be tortured and executed. The duffel bags were likely filled with weapons or cash. The passengers were eventually transferred to another bus and continued their journey, but the atmosphere was completely changed. The quiet, anonymous trust was gone, replaced by a thick, palpable cloud of fear and suspicion. Every new passenger was a potential threat. Every unscheduled stop was a cause for panic. Ben finally made it to El Paso, but the journey had broken something in him. He had spent hours sitting next to pure, cold-blooded evil. He had been a helpless spectator to a brutal kidnapping, a pawn in a deadly game played by monsters. He had looked into the eyes of a man who killed for a living and had seen nothing but a cold, dead emptiness. He never took a night bus again. The memory of the Z tattoo, the silent pickup truck, and the terrified eyes of the bound man was a permanent scar. He had learned a terrifying lesson that night on that lonely stretch of Texas highway. The bus is not just a mode of transport. Sometimes it's a tool for darkness, and you never know if the person sitting next to you is just another passenger or if you're simply a piece of temporary camouflage for the real, terrifying cargo the bus is carrying. Story 3. The Whispering Man. The journey through the Appalachian Mountains at night is a descent into an ancient and profound darkness. The highways twist and turn through dense, primeval forests that seem to swallow the road, and the small towns that dot the landscape feel isolated, holding secrets as old as the hills themselves. Our final story comes from this region, from a young artist named Maya, who, in 2017, was traveling from Asheville, North Carolina, to Knoxville, Tennessee. It was a relatively short trip, only a few hours, but it became an eternity when she found herself the unwilling audience for a man who was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Maya was a painter and illustrator, and she often found inspiration in the strange, liminal spaces of travel. She saw the night bus as a rolling diorama of human experience, a place of quiet contemplation. She boarded the bus in Asheville late on a chilly October evening. The bus was old and rattled, and less than a quarter full. It was the last bus of the night, the ghost run, as some drivers called it. She chose a seat near the middle, on the driver's side, and was pleased to find she had the entire row to herself. As the bus rumbled out of the station and began its climb into the dark, misty mountains, Maya pulled out her sketchbook and a charcoal pencil, hoping to capture the fleeting shapes of the trees against the night sky. At a small, almost forgotten stop just outside the national park, one last passenger boarded. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of sharp angles. He was tall and painfully thin, with a long, narrow face, a pointed chin, and a shock of unruly black hair. He wore a threadbare tweed jacket that was too big for his skeletal frame, and he clutched a worn, leather-bound book to his chest as if it were a holy relic. He walked down the aisle, his movements jerky and bird-like. His eyes, wide and dark, darted around the bus, not looking at the empty seats, but at the dark windows, as if searching for something in the reflection. He passed Maya, went to the back, then turned and came back, his strange, scanning gaze making her skin crawl. He stopped abruptly at her row. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice a surprisingly deep, resonant baritone that seemed at odds with his frail appearance. "No, it's free," Maya said, her voice small. The man didn't sit next to her. Instead, he slid into the seat directly behind her, a choice that was somehow more unsettling. Maya could feel his presence right at her back, a strange, nervous energy radiating from him. She tried to ignore it and focus on her sketching, but she was acutely aware of every small sound he made, the rustle of his jacket, the creak of the seat as he shifted his weight. For the first 20 minutes, he was completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the squeal of the tires on the winding mountain roads. Maya began to relax, convincing herself he was just another strange traveler. Then he began to whisper. It was so faint at first that she thought it was just the wind or the tires. But it was a voice. His voice. A low, continuous, sibilant stream of words, flowing like a dark, hidden river. It was coming from directly behind her head. She strained to hear what he was saying, but she couldn't make out the individual words. It wasn't English. It was a language she had never heard before, full of harsh, guttural sounds and soft, hissing consonants. It sounded ancient, ritualistic. A cold knot of fear began to form in her stomach. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't listening to a recording. He was whispering to himself in a strange, unknown tongue. As the bus climbed higher into the mountains, the whispering grew in intensity. It was no longer just a faint murmur. It was a steady, insistent monologue. It was as if he were reciting a prayer, a chant, or an incantation. The rhythmic, hypnotic quality of the whispering was deeply unnerving. It seemed to worm its way into her brain, making it hard to think. Maya tried to put on her headphones, but the whispering seemed to cut right through the music. It was a low, pervasive frequency that vibrated at the base of her skull. She gave up on sketching, her hand trembling too much to hold the pencil steady. She sat rigid in her seat, her senses on high alert, every nerve ending screaming at her. Then, the nature of the whispering changed. It was no longer a monologue. It became a conversation. She could hear him pause as if listening for a reply. And in the brief, silent gaps, she could almost hear another voice. It wasn't a real, audible sound. It was more like a psychic impression, a faint, high-pitched, static-like whisper that seemed to form inside her own head. It was thin, reedy, and filled with a chilling, inhuman malice. The man would whisper his strange language, then pause, and in the silence, Maya would hear the faint, terrible reply. He was talking to someone who was right there in the seat with him, someone only he, and now, somehow she, could perceive. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a disturbed man talking to himself. This was a man in communion with something else, something unseen. The man's whispering grew more agitated. His tone shifted from recitation to argument. He sounded like he was pleading, then cajoling, then growing angry. The silent, static-like replies in Maya's head grew more insistent, more demanding. A terrifying, one-sided drama was playing out directly behind her. She risked a quick, fearful glance into the reflection of her dark window. She could see the man's distorted shape in the seat behind her. He was leaning forward, his face close to the back of her seat. He was no longer looking at the window. He was looking at her, or rather, at the empty space right beside her. He was whispering to the empty aisle seat next to her. Maya's heart felt like it was going to explode. The unseen entity was not in the seat with him. It was next to her. He had been talking to it over her shoulder this entire time. She was sitting in the middle of their horrifying conversation. She was completely, utterly trapped, pinned against the window, with a madman behind her and an invisible, malevolent entity beside her. The bus was a speeding metal coffin, and she was its only conscious victim. The man's voice rose in a sudden, sharp crescendo. He spat out a series of harsh, angry-sounding words. Then he fell silent. The humming of the engine seemed deafening. In the silence, the man leaned forward until his lips were right next to Maya's ear. She could feel his cold breath on her neck. "He doesn't like you," the man whispered, his voice now a clear, terrifying English. "He says your soul is the wrong color. He wants to fix it." Maya stopped breathing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was not random madness. It was directed. It was focused on her. "He wants me to use the book," the man whispered, his voice filled with a strange mixture of fear and reverence. "He says it's time. He says you're the one." Maya could hear him fumbling with the large, leather-bound book he had been clutching. She heard the soft crackle of old pages turning. "Please," she whimpered, the word barely audible. "Please stop." "I can't," the man breathed, his voice trembling with a terrible excitement. "He insists. It will only hurt for a moment. He promises to make you beautiful." This was it. He was going to do something. He was going to perform some terrible ritual, guided by the unseen thing that was sitting next to her. She had to move. She had to escape. With a surge of pure animalistic adrenaline, Maya launched herself out of her seat. She didn't ask for permission. She scrambled over the armrest and into the aisle, falling to her hands and knees. She crawled, crab-like, up the aisle towards the front of the bus, away from the whispering man and his invisible companion. "The offering is trying to flee," the man shrieked from behind her, his voice no longer a whisper but a high-pitched, frantic cry. "We can't let it escape." The few other sleeping passengers were jolted awake by the commotion. They saw Maya crawling on the floor and the tall, thin man standing up behind her, his eyes wide with manic fury, the old book held open in his hands. The bus driver, a burly man with a thick beard, saw the scene in his rearview mirror. He hit the brakes, the bus lurching to a stop. "Hey, what in God's name is going on?" Maya reached the front of the bus and collapsed near the driver's feet, sobbing hysterically. "He's crazy! He's trying to kill me!" The driver stood up, grabbing a heavy metal tire iron from beside his seat. "Sit down and shut your mouth, or I'll shut it for you," he growled at the man. The man stood in the aisle, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between Maya, the driver, and the empty seat she had just vacated. He looked like a cornered animal. "You don't understand," he hissed. "She is chosen. The vessel is prepared. He is waiting." He took a step forward, raising the book as if to ward off the driver. The driver took a step to meet him, brandishing the tire iron. For a tense, terrifying moment, the two men faced off in the aisle of the dimly lit bus, surrounded by a handful of terrified passengers. Then, with a final, despairing cry, the man turned and did something completely unexpected. He raised the heavy book and smashed it against the emergency exit window next to his seat. The tempered glass spiderwebbed, but didn't break. He smashed it again and again, his thin arms moving with a frenzied, unnatural strength. On the fourth try, the window shattered, exploding outwards into the night. Before anyone could react, the man threw his book out into the darkness, and then, with a final, wild look at Maya, he climbed through the broken window and jumped from the moving bus. The bus was plunged into chaos. The driver immediately stopped and called 911. The police and an ambulance arrived, but a search of the dark, forested area beside the highway revealed nothing. The man, like his book, had been swallowed by the Appalachian night. Maya was too traumatized to continue her journey. The police drove her to a motel in the next town. She never found out who the man was, or if he had survived the jump. She was left with only the terrifying, unanswered questions. What was in that book? What was the invisible entity he was speaking to? And what would have happened to her if she hadn't escaped? She had been a participant in a horrifying, supernatural event, a brush with a madness that transcended the merely human. She had learned that the quietest passengers can be the most dangerous, and that on a dark mountain road, you can find yourself sitting in on a conversation with the devil himself.